Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast. Episode number 142. We're talking about Redux today and the ecosystem around it. We are your hosts today, Justin Ribeiro and Amal Hussein. Amal, how's it going?
It's going awesome.
We're going to have a great episode today. I love talking about Redux. But before we get there, since Leon is currently on hiatus today, we're going to talk about This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less with me, generally. Justin, go ahead, Justin. Thank you, Justin. So, TypeScript 2.6, the release candidate, is now available on GitHub, which includes some new features such as strict function types and localized diagnostics, and very much more. We'll put a link into the show notes so you can take a look at that. The popular testing tool Cypress is now in public beta for the first time and has been made open source, so that's exciting news. PayPal has open sourced a suite of cross-domain JavaScript tools. They recently released a post on Medium about that, and we'll put that in the show notes as well. Node 8.7 has been released, which includes a fancy new Mac OS X installer. Ooh, fancy installer. And that's currently available on node.js.org. Babel 7 is getting pretty close to release at this point, as Beta 3 has simply landed onto the GitHub. So if you're looking to get your final testing against Babel, do go grab Beta 3. And finally, today, GitHub has open sourced the accessibility scanner that they use to check websites for accessibility issues with elements. And that is also available on GitHub today. Next week is Chrome Dev Summit, so if you're out there, make sure to watch the live stream. And that has been This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less. Back to you, Justin. Thanks, Justin. Some interesting stuff in there, Amal. I was surprised that Justin had so many interesting topics to point out.
Yeah, Justin. I like Justin's alter ego. He's awesome.
The joys of radio/podcasting. You're only one voice modulation away from an alter ego. And speaking of alter egos, let's talk about some data. Let's talk about Redux and things. Our guest this week is Mark Erikson. Mark, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Hi, I appreciate it. Really glad to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Mark. You know, we hear things on the web that you are now considered officially the Redux guy. So please tell us a little bit about yourself.
I don't know about officially, maybe unofficially in some ways, but I'm a software engineer. I live and work in Dayton, Ohio, which is not exactly a hotbed of modern web development or really modern anything in a lot of ways. But I work at a very large government contractor, which is also not a hotbed of modern anything. But fortunately, I've managed to find myself a pretty good niche within the company where I can actually make use of some things like React and Redux to some extent in my day job. And then I do it a lot more in my free time.
That's awesome. And I guess, can you tell us a little bit about what what your journey was into the Redux community and how you became the Redux guy?
Sure. So I really got into, I guess, modern web development in early 2013. It actually started off with Backbone. My team was trying to build a new application from scratch, and I'd been reading all these articles about JavaScript MVC frameworks, and it sounded like a good thing to use, except we didn't start the project by actually using one. It was just jQuery, which turned out to be interesting. So later that year, we did some research, and I decided that Backbone was probably the best fit for trying to quickly retrofit the jQuery code base we had just built. And so over the next couple of years, I became very familiar with Backbone and the plugins and the ecosystem around that. And in mid-2015, I began thinking about reworking a GWT app that I had built a few years earlier. GWT stands for Google Web Toolkit. It's a Java to JavaScript compiler. And the problem was that, well, there are several problems. I'll try not to go into all the details. But basically, I felt that the GWT client for this other app I built was now really a hindrance rather than a help. And so I started researching other options to be able to maybe build a brand new client for that application from scratch, and looked at a few other things and finally decided I would give this React idea a shot. And this was really right about the same time Redux had come out. And so I was doing my usual thing where I go Google for 5 million blog posts and articles and tutorials and just read everything I can find on the topic. And in the process, I ran across this set of chat channels that had just opened up called Reactiflux. And it's a set of channels dedicated to talking about React and related technologies. So I just began hanging out in the channels and working and reading and trying to just learn from what everyone else was talking about, and eventually got to the point where I actually knew the answers to some questions. And so being the helpful person that I am, I tried to answer the questions. And then I started seeing that, someone would ask a question and there was a link, and I knew that an article that I'd read recently helped with that. So I would paste in the links to the articles. And then it all kind of snowballed from there. I kept seeing the same questions over and over. So I volunteered to write an FAQ for Redux. And then I wanted to start putting together a list of all the articles that I kept referring people to. And that turned into this giant list on GitHub. And then Dan gave me commit rights on Redux after I wrote the FAQ. And eventually I got so involved and Dan was busy with React stuff at Facebook, he kind of turned over the keys to Redux to myself and a couple other people. So it was never anything I really intended to do. It just sort of happened because I kept trying to be helpful.
That's the problem with open source. You try to be helpful, and the next thing you know, they give you the keys to the castle.
Yeah.
So, have you enjoyed working within the Redux community as someone who sort of possibly accidentally inherited it over
Well,
the
yes.
span of contributions?
If I didn't enjoy it, I wouldn't keep doing it. But it's I gave this talk at React Boston a couple weeks ago. It was my first ever conference talk, and I wrapped up the talk by saying that what really excites me is the stuff that's going on in the Redux community. The Redux library itself is fairly stable, and we might talk about this a bit more later on, but people are building all kinds of cool things around Redux to solve the problems that they're dealing with. And so that really excites me.
So you never have moments of like, this crown looks great on me, but it's a little too big.
Well, I do feel there's been some interesting discussion lately about imposter syndrome and kind of wondering, like, am I really qualified to do this kind of thing, whether it be at work or otherwise? And so I like to think I'm a fairly good programmer, and I do know that I know a fair amount that maybe other people don't, but I also try to maintain a sane perspective about it. So yeah, I do sometimes wonder, it's like, how did I actually wind up in this situation in the first place?
It can be difficult when you're just trying to you're not necessarily looking to make an impact. You're just trying to be helpful. Right. And all of a sudden now you're in the midst of that thing. Most people, I think, underestimate their programming skills. Sans myself, I am, terrible at it. It's amazing people leave me at a keyboard most of the time. But as someone who works on such a large project now, you talk about the community of Redux. There are quite a few projects that really rely on Redux at its core in terms of just the expansion of that ecosystem. It's been quite large in the last year, it seems like.
Yeah. I don't think either Dan or Andrew, the creators, really anticipated just how much it would take off. So in 2014, Facebook announced this whole Flux architecture idea as an alternative to kind of traditional model view controller based logic. And so for the next year, there was this whole explosion of libraries that implemented this Flux architecture in different ways. And so when Dan started working on Redux, he was just thinking, in fact, I think he actually tweeted, oh no, am I really writing my own Flux library? So it wasn't like Dan set out to write something that would kind of become the de facto standard. He was just playing around with some ideas and really just trying to kind of show off an idea at a conference. And it turned out so well that it just took over.
Yeah. So I mean, for me, that's the best part of open source work, and in general with web technologies. We borrow and build from each other's ideas. We also get to kind of evolve on other awesome ideas and have people contribute without negativity. I think one of the coolest things is about Redux is, the creator of Flux giving a high five to Dan. Like, this is awesome, And so before we get too far into talking more about Redux, can we take a minute to just define it? I'm sure most of our listeners
Sure.
know what it is, but I'm curious to hear how you would briefly define what is Redux in your own words.
Okay. There's probably many different descriptions I could give, but I'll see if I can come up with one as I'm talking about it. So Redux is a state management library for JavaScript, where state basically means any data that you would want to store in your application. So that could be data that you've retrieved from the server, data that describes, am I showing a left pane or a toggle dialog, or is the dropdown open? And any variables or data that you would have in your application, you could put into Redux. And so Redux it's somewhere between a library and a pattern for how you organize where that data lives and the process of updating that data. So for example, maybe with a backbone application, you would have a backbone model and you pass around a reference to that model. And in any part of your code that has a reference to that model, you could call model.set some field, and it changes the model right there. And then maybe other parts of the UI are listening for change events on the model and they react. With Redux, it asks you to separate the write logic or the update logic conceptually from the rest of your code. Now you can organize it in files however you want, but conceptually, you should keep your write logic away from all of the display logic or the logic that's responsible for maybe going out and fetching data. And you combine all this write logic into a single function called a reducer that is responsible for processing updates and generating a new state. So Redux asks you, put most of your data into a single state tree, so it's all connected to a single parent object. Use a single function to update that data, and do so by updating the data immutably, which means you make copies and you update the copies of the data instead of directly modifying the original. Now, this does introduce more overhead because you can't just directly say, some object dot some value equals 1, 2, 3. There's some indirection and some intermediate steps that you are asked to go through. But as a result of adding this kind of indirection and separation, it introduces a lot of really useful possibilities, like the ability to see the history of what descriptive actions were sent to the store. So you can see maybe there was an add to do action dispatched and it had the text of the new to do, or the toggle to do action with the index of the to do to change from completed to uncompleted. And so you can see the history, you can see how things changed, and you can even use the Redux developer tools to jump back and forth in the history. And so because there's this level of indirection, it enables some very, very powerful developer capabilities to understand when your data changed, why your data changed, how it changed, and what caused the change in the first place. So that's maybe more than a short description, but it's a description.
Yeah, that was probably the best description I've heard ever. Thank you. I love that. I love that analogy of like why your data, why it changed, when it changed, how it changed. That's incredible. And that's what has made Redux as popular as it is. Can you talk a little bit more about the popularity of Redux in terms of who's using it? I think a lot of people associate Redux and React, and it is something that is agnostic. And can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. So, Redux is primarily associated with the React community for several reasons. One is that Dan Abramov, who created Redux, does actually work on the React team at Facebook right now. And I would say that the majority of Redux users are also probably React users as well. The official library that binds together Redux and React is considered official. And so the Redux team actually maintains both the Redux library and the React Redux bindings. But Redux is completely agnostic to any UI layer. There are other bindings, so you can use it from Angular 1, Angular 2, Ember, Vue, even hooking up Redux to like plain JavaScript classes or anything. And in fact, at one point, Dan Abramov added another example to the Redux repo called counter vanilla. So there was already a counter example that connected a Redux store to a little React component and had a little counter. You click the button and it increments. And he did another version of that is plain JavaScript. So you just have document.add event listener, listening for a button click. And when you click the button, it dispatches an action to the Redux store. And the store subscriber simply takes the counter value and directly modifies the inner text of some div in the page. So Redux itself can be used independent of any UI layer. It is fairly popular with the Angular community in some ways. Angular also has their own version of Redux called NGRX, which implements the same API and concepts, but it's implemented using observables internally.
Yeah, I actually don't use it with Redux. Or I'm sorry, I don't use Redux rather with React. Because people ask often when I go give talks and things, and they say, Justin, do you use Redux? And I'm like, yes. And they're like, oh, how do you use it with React? And I'm like, I don't.
So what do you use it with?
I use it with Polymer.
Okay.
I think, in a world where everyone loves to draw their lines, which I think is funny because you talk to the maintainers and the maintainers are like, I didn't draw a line. I just built a thing. But, Redux is actually one of those things to your, extensive list there that it is relatively easy to wire into other things. It's not necessarily easy to migrate. If you've ever tried to migrate Backbone, for instance, I don't know that, I think it's in the FAQ, like not necessarily easiest thing to do. But realistically, you can wire it up to pretty much whatever you like. And it's just simply not that hard. The documentation is very good, which I always give props to open source projects with lots of documentation. And you guys have very good documentation across the board, which I think is one reason that it is so used. A lot of, hey, why don't you use my project? I'm like, you don't have any documentation.
Yep.
Documentation is key.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's definitely there's got to be some correlation, and I hope somebody does a study on this, but between adoption and documentation, right? And so if you don't have a storefront sign, no one's going to come to your store unless they're hipsters and know about your store because they're hipsters. But yeah, I really think that your documentation is I think what makes the barrier to entry so low. Not just the docs, but the examples and, all that good stuff. So really kudos to you guys.
Yeah, Dan Abramov definitely deserves most of the credit for that, because he put a lot of thought into writing the docs in the first place. And I know I spent a fair amount of time earlier this year researching a lot of the history and the development process that went into Redux for some blog posts I was writing. And during that process, I came across a lot of very interesting discussions and comments from, primarily from Dan and Andrew. And Dan had a tweet at one point where he was saying, it's hard trying to write the docs and balance the target audiences, because you need to be able to talk to Flux users who are wondering how Redux is different, Backbone users who are wondering what this Flux idea is at all, maybe people who are more familiar with RxJS, people who have never heard of any of the above, and how do you actually kind of balance those targets? And so Dan's style in particular really seems to lean towards explaining concepts from first principles. If you ever have a chance to watch the Introduction to Redux video series he did for egghead.io, he really teaches Redux concepts by building them up from scratch. And a lot of people have said that those videos really, really were key for them understanding Redux. And so the major portions of the Redux tutorial follow a similar kind of pattern. So they don't just tell you, here's the API, or here's some code to copy and paste. They kind of walk you through, why does this stuff exist in the first place? Now, different people have different learning styles. And so I've definitely heard from people who have looked at the docs and said, this approach isn't necessarily helpful for me, but I do think that is useful for a lot of people.
And the API footprint within Redux itself is not terribly huge. I mean, I think that goes to the nature of the way you sort of build it up, right? You when you talk about, oh, well, this is how you approach these sorts of actual problems, as opposed to me just screaming to you, here's an endpoint or here's a method that you need to call to make this magic happen that I'm not going to explain to you from a magic standpoint. Because a lot of times when people start to build software, I mean, as someone who has built a lot of software for a long time, you see a lot of people go into something and go, I'm going to use this thing, this lib, this framework, this thing, whatever it may be. And then you ask, why? What problem does that particularly solve for you? And then they don't really have an answer for that. They're like, it is because I saw it and it was really cool and it, lots of people use it. And I'm like, but how are you fundamentally going to use it? What problem does it solve for you? And if you don't take that into account, I mean, you do run into problems, regardless of your API footprint size. But I always find that Redux is actually really easy to dive into. People seem to take to it relatively simple, though, again, I think it kind of depends on which background you come from.
Right. Yeah. It does require a mindset shift in a lot of ways. Switching from, model classes with mutable state into a more functional programming kind of approach. And especially dealing with immutability is a big stumbling point for a lot of people.
Well, so I think for me, one of the things that I love about Redux is it kind of, it's very good at enforcing a modular pattern, right? So like the library itself does very little. I mean, it does a lot, but it's a single responsibility. And if you wanted to do more, you use its middleware architecture to add on custom behavior through importing your own handwritten module or a third-party library. And I really love that. I think you can the kind of choose your own adventure part of Redux is got to be my favorite. It kind of satisfies people that are like minimalists, and then people who want like the kitchen sink. You can kind of customize it as much as you want.
Oh yeah. So this goes off into one of my simultaneously favorite and least favorite topics, which is the dreaded word boilerplate. Boilerplate. I'm so tired of hearing that word. It's the number, like when people complain about Redux, it's by far the number one complaint. Oh, I have to write so much boilerplate to get everything done. And there is and there isn't truth to that complaint. Like I said earlier, Redux does ask that you add a level of indirection. Instead of just being able to call model.set some value, it wants you to dispatch an action to the store. And then the reducer function is supposed to look at the action and decide how the state should actually be updated. So when people complain about boilerplate, there's usually several things that they're actually thinking of. One is, oh no, I have to define action constants, and I have to put them in a separate file so that I can refer to them in my reducers file and my action creators file. And I have to use these action creator functions to even create the actions in the first place. And I have to have 6 different files just to implement one simple feature. And the thing is, Redux doesn't require you to actually do any of those steps other than dispatching an action object. How you structure your code in terms of files and defining constants and everything is entirely up to you. And so my usual answer when I see this complaint is you can use as much or as little abstraction on top of Redux as you want. There are good reasons why a lot of these common usage patterns exist, like having separate files for reducer functions and action creator functions and action type constants. But you don't have to separate the things that way if you don't want to. And so if you want to write other functions that abstract over a lot of this process and maybe kind of generate the commonly reused code for you, you can. So, but I think that also kind of goes into a couple other issues. Because Redux is so unopinionated in a lot of ways, it's leaving these choices up to you to make. And so if you are someone who's looking for that out of the box, here's the one single approved way to go, Redux really isn't going to give you that. And so if you're not comfortable making those kinds of decisions, you may have a harder time trying to decide on what kind of conventions you ought to follow.
I find that to be the case for a lot of things these days, though. Even, I mean, you can, pick sort of something out of the hat where you hear the complaint about boilerplate, and I often cringe myself because I'm like, at some point you actually do have to architect the thing you want to build.
Right.
You have to step back and say, this is the thing I'm going to build, and how am I going to build it? Like, it doesn't have to be, I'm not saying it has to be some ginormous piece of documentation or, some defined out amount of sprints that you're going to do, but you have to have a plan. And a lot of times now, and I don't know, I don't know if this is just I hear it from so many different people that I don't quite understand why. Because at the end of the day, I remember when we had no tooling and things, and then you're like, haha, you're just going to have to build it anyway. But these days, everyone seems to want pure single variation. This is the only way to do it sort of ways. And if that was software, it'd be kind of boring. I don't think I would have gone into it if everything was just automatically the same all the time. But yeah, boilerplate, terrible word.
I have a small theory. Oh, no, go ahead, Mark.
Sorry. I think a lot of people also maybe are trying to over-optimize for initial speed of getting started and saving on the number of keystrokes typed. Now, don't get me wrong. I dislike duplication. I don't want to be typing the exact same thing or almost exact same thing over and over and over and over again. I understand that point of view, but I would rather spend a little more time to write things out in a slightly more verbose way, but to where it's very clear exactly what's going on, and to be able to set up the system in a way where I can trace the data flow and how all the pieces fit together. Dan Abramov has described as having a code base be greppable. In other words, if I want to know where a thing is used, can I actually search for it in the code base? And I've done some little bits of clever code in the past where I was mangling some strings and combining them together and using those transformed strings to look up event handlers. And the code works, and it's not the worst code that I've written. But if I was trying to search, like if I was someone who's coming into that code and I didn't know how all the pieces fit together to begin with, and I was trying to find where those bits are, it might be noticeably harder to see where those pieces are and how they fit together. Whereas if you do take the time and write things out in a little more explicit way up front, I think a lot of times you can wind up with a more maintainable code base long term. There's no guarantee, and it's totally possible to misuse and write a bad Redux code base. But I do tend to lean more towards that explicit, write it out up front idea these days.
So I again, I think I could quote Dan Abramov all day long, but
you and me both.
It's such a genius thing. I mean, talk about being able to write code that's maintainable, right? Is it greppable? Is it that's genius. I've never heard that before. So I think there's a point that I'd like to make here around why developers just want to be told what to do. There's a lot of fatigue in our community, right? There's new things popping up every day. Concepts don't get time to kind of sink in. Everybody needs time to really sift on ideas and just let them sit in their brain for a little bit. And when you're always learning something new, it's really hard for much to gel, let alone having to have a strong understanding of something, So I it's why imposter syndrome is so prevalent. It's why, people are just tired of making decisions around new tooling, right? And so, while I am in the camp of, yourself and Justin, I sympathize and I understand why people are just like, show me how to do it. And I don't want to really think about it. So, so that said, I think really I want to dive more into the ecosystem. But before we do that, do you want to just quickly summarize maybe some of the most common questions on Redux, and maybe just kind of highlight some of your, you have a famous FAQ. So
it's famous now, is it?
I think it's famous, and I think it is. I think you're famous for it. And so can you maybe just give us a quick overview of that?
Sure. So like I said, this is literally questions that I saw being asked over and over in the React Flux chat channels, on Stack Overflow, on Reddit, on Twitter. And so when I offered to write this FAQ page in the first place, I did base the list of questions off the actual questions I was being seen asked. I would say, well, probably the two that I refer to the most are, so the first one, do I literally have to put all the data in my application into a Redux store? Am I ever allowed to use something else, like a React component state or some kind of local variable? And the answer to that is, it's entirely up to you. Now, in that FAQ, I have a list of some suggested rules of thumb for when you might want to put certain types of data into the Redux store. Things like, does any other part of the application need this data? Do you maybe want to derive some values from the original data? Do multiple components care about this? Do you want to be able to see the changes over time as actions are dispatched? Do you want to maybe cache the data as you're going back and forth between routes in your application? But it really is up to you as your application's developer to decide, okay, this state should be global. It does belong in the Redux store. Or this state, it's really local. The classic example is, is this dropdown toggled open right now? The rest of the application probably doesn't care about that information, and so it's perfectly fine to keep that in just a React component. Now, I've seen people go to the extent of saying you literally must put every piece of data in your application into the Redux store, and also along with that, say every component in your application should be a functional component instead of a class component. I personally find that to be very, very dogmatic and over-opinionated, but I can also understand why someone might think that way, because now everything in your app is traceable and pure and very straightforward. So yeah, number one question is definitely, do I literally have to put everything into Redux? And that's also affected because one of the principles in the Redux docs is a single state tree for your app. It's more like a single state tree for whatever you actually want to put in there. The other one, I'll list two others. A second one is, how do I share state between slice reducers? So Redux comes with a utility function called combine reducers, and it's the suggested way for splitting up your reducer logic into smaller pieces. So maybe in a blog application, you would have three main types of data: users, posts, and comments. And so you would write separate reducer functions for each of those types of data. And then you would use the combine reducers utility to make a bigger reducers function that works at the top of the state tree. But combine reducers deliberately does not allow you to pass those slices back and forth. So the users reducer only sees the state.users slice. The post reducer only sees the state.post slice, and so on. And so the answer to that question is, you could dispatch an action and include more data from the other slices into the action so that each of the slice reducers can extract the other pieces it needs because you gave it the extra data. Or maybe the combine reducers utility isn't the best fit for what you want to do. And so you could write your own function that combines reducers in a different way, or there's many other third-party reducer utilities that can pass some slices back and forth. And then the third FAQ that I'll point out is, should I only connect the topmost component to Redux, or should I connect many different components to Redux? And really early on, Dan's suggestion was to only connect the top component, but as time's gone on and we've seen how Redux is used in the real world, it really does make sense to connect any component in your tree to Redux so that it only extracts just the data that component or its immediate descendants need. And this actually winds up being better for performance because React Redux will only re-render a component if the data it needs changed. And so if a component extracts less data from the Redux store, then the odds are that when something changes, it's not relevant to that component, and that component doesn't need to re-render. So there's a bunch of other questions, but I would say those three are probably the ones I refer to the most.
That's thank you. I felt like that was a lesson for me, the last one, because I adopted Redux so early on. I didn't get the memo about your last point. That's good to know. And so really briefly, on the flip side of that, we talked about the questions, but what are the common misconceptions on Redux besides the boilerplate thing, which we discussed,
which we could go on about for a while.
Yeah, just you can list them off.
I think I've actually hit on some of these already. So people assume you can only use it with React, and you can use it by itself. You can use it with any UI layer. People assume that you have to organize your files in a certain way. which you don't have to. Redux literally could not care less about how you organize your files. Let's see. This is a dirty little secret of Redux. Redux by itself, the core library, doesn't even care if you mutate your state. You can mutate state in a reducer. You could make an AJAX call in a reducer function. You are absolutely not supposed to. That's not how you're intended to use Redux, but you can. The Redux library doesn't poke around in the guts of your reducer function to make sure you're not doing any of these things. If you want to go trigger an AJAX call from a reducer function, you can. But the intended use of Redux is that you follow certain patterns.
Yeah, I think that's the funny thing about most libs, to be honest, is that they're, they're pattern libs, right? I want to operate within a set of constraints so that, one, my software is maintainable, two, that I can update it when patches are available, and three, that when other developers come, they can operate on the same assumptions because the pattern is there. But side effects are funny because I see side effects in code that I review every once in a while where someone's decided that, you know what, I just have to do this thing. And sometimes you get it. You're looking at it going, yeah, I see what you did there. And it makes me chuckle. And we have a conversation about it. And, you try to find a different way to not mangle something. But I do think it's interesting because I know that I'm almost positive it says that in the documentation in terms of what they, particularly for reducers that, hey, you shouldn't be, making calls out. But there's nothing really preventing you from doing so.
Nothing whatsoever.
So, yeah, other than the fact that, do you want to adhere to the pattern? Come with us. Be part of the pattern.
So speaking of patterns, nice segue into the ecosystem. So people evolving.
One of my favorite topics.
Yeah, and so and I was actually lucky enough to be at your talk that you gave at React Boston, and it was just really insightful. And you talked about 300 plus libraries and growing, and I couldn't believe that you even listed all of them.
I have to nitpick a correction here.
Is it 200 plus?
The ecosystem. My ecosystem add-ons catalog has over 1,900 entries. I only listed about 100 in that talk.
Oh, okay. All right. My number was somewhere in the middle. I remember it was fairly large. So I can't believe 1,900. Okay, wow, that's even more crazy. So can you talk a little bit about what spurred that growth and
Sure.
What makes Redux so extensible?
Okay, so I guess I get to give the 2-minute version of a 50-minute talk. Great. So Dan and Andrew deliberately designed Redux from the ground up to be extensible. And they were especially focused on things like how do you do side effects, asynchronous behavior, making AJAX calls or timeouts and stuff like that. And they designed Redux in a way that the core is really, really simple, but you can plug in additional kinds of behaviors and logic into that core, and then you can write other capabilities that make use of the core in the process. So the three major types of add-ons for Redux are reusable reducer functions. So maybe you write a function that knows how to add undo redo capabilities or resetting a slice of state, and you can use that and wrap up some other reducer function to add that capability. The second method is called middleware, and this allows you to inspect and transform action objects and other values that have been passed to the store's dispatch method. And so this is the main way that you can plug side effects capabilities into Redux. And so maybe if you just want to write some functions and promises to dispatch actions, you can do that. If you want to use generator functions to write synchronous looking code that does asynchronous behavior, you can plug that in. If you prefer to use observables like RxJS to do asynchronous behavior, you can plug that in. And middleware also allow you to do things like logging out the state before and after an action was dispatched, or maybe something like persisting the contents of the store, or even something goofy like maybe playing a sound effect when an action is dispatched. And then the third category is something called a store enhancer. And this is basically wrapping up the Redux store with another layer that adds capabilities. So the Redux dev tools, which track the history of dispatched actions and allow you to jump back and forth in the history, are actually implemented as a store enhancer. And in fact, Redux's apply middleware tool, which is built in, is also a store enhancer. So it adds extra capabilities to a basic, simple Redux store. And then there's many other things as well. There's functions to generate action creators and reducers, especially ones that are similar to each other, so you don't have to rewrite the same functions by hand. There are React components that know how to talk to Redux out of the box. There's utility functions like reselect that allow you to pull data out of the store in an optimized way. So there's all kinds of different tools that people have built around Redux for their own specific use cases.
That's super cool. And so where can people find your list? And then also, can you maybe give us some examples of, you mentioned there's 3 categories. Can you give us some examples of a few tools in each of the categories?
Sure. So my Redux add-ons catalog is at github.com/Mark Erikson. One word, there's no C in my name, /Redux-ecosystem-links. And let's see, some quick examples of each category. So going off some of the items that I mentioned in the talk, if you wanted to use an alternative to the built-in combine reducers function, and maybe your user's reducer does need some data from the post slice, there are some reducer functions that allow you to say that one slice reducer needs some data from another slice of state, and it will make sure that it passes that extra data in as a third argument in addition to its own slice and the action. There are higher order reducer functions like Redux recycle or Redux undo that allow you to do things like resetting slices of state or adding undo capability to a reducer. Most of the side effects libraries are implemented as middleware. The most popular ones are Redux Thunk, which lets you pass functions into the dispatch method, and then the middleware calls the function and passes in dispatch and get state, and now you can do anything asynchronous you want in that kind of loophole. Redux Saga, which lets you use generator functions for side effects, and Redux Observable, which lets you use observables for side effects. A couple of development middleware that are really helpful. Redux Logger lets you connect it up, and then it will print to the console the previous state, the next state, the diff, and the contents of the action every time an action is dispatched. And just to pick one other development middleware, there's a couple of them that will freeze your state tree so that if you accidentally try to mutate some of the state, it'll throw an error rather than going undetected.
Oh la la! The last one sounds like a developer nanny or something like that. It's like a little slap on the wrist. Nope, you're mutating state. That's so cool. That's awesome. And so thank you for kind of highlighting that. I'm looking at the list right now, and it's like grown since the last time I looked at this. Can we talk a little bit about the Redux roadmap? So we know the libraries seems fairly stable at this point. Is there any evolution, that's kind of on the roadmap for the core library, or is all the evolution just through the extensions at this point?
Honestly, there is not much of a roadmap right now. So Redux went through 3 major versions in like the first 3 months after it came out. And I think even really version 2 and version 3 were, I think Dan mostly just like removed the replace reducer function, then decided to put it back in. And the core Redux library itself has not meaningfully changed really since then. So in the last 2 years, the React Redux API has been pretty consistent and stable for the last 2 years as well. We've added some more nuances in terms of some optimized things you can do for passing in map state to props or map dispatch to props functions. And we actually did a complete rewrite of the internal implementation of React Redux, which was released as version 5, but we kept the exact same public API. Beyond that, we do have a few ideas and proposals floating around in the issues and PRs list. Dan in particular had wanted to make some tweaks to the way store enhancers are defined and initialized internally. And so he put together a PR with an idea for that. And it's just kind of been really sitting around for the last 1.5 years, and we haven't gotten back to it. At this point, we really don't have any specific plans to really meaningfully change the API or add more major features going forward, because it really does exactly what it needs to, and because it's extensible and people are building all kinds of interesting stuff on top of it. Now, having said that, this does lead into one of my other kind of personal pet ideas. I do hear a lot of complaints that Redux is too unopinionated. It's too configurable. It asks you to go pick out your side effects approach and all these other pieces and put them together. And if you like to do that, that's great. But what if I just kind of want to get started and have call one function and have a working store that's set up with some nice defaults or something? And so I'm pretty sure there are some third-party packages that offer something like that. But I would like to try to find some ways to maybe have some kind of a Redux starter preset or something. So that maybe provides a configure store function that pulls in several of the commonly used utility packages like Redux Thunk, Redux Actions, Reselect, and at least hooks those up out of the box for you so you don't have to do the initial store configuration all by yourself. I'm also really, really fascinated by different kinds of abstractions that people are building on top of Redux. Redux is really a set of low-level primitives. One of my favorite quotes is that it's a tool for building your own customized state management platform with the ability to reuse some of the add-ons and the developer tools. And so people have built a number of very higher level abstractions on top of Redux. Some of them kind of maintain the same spirit of how Redux was intended to be used. Others take it in some very different directions. And so that kind of stuff really fascinates me. And I think that some of those might be better solutions for people than kind of using plain raw Redux out of the box. So long answer, short answer is we don't really intend to change the core library. We have a few tweaks we might get around to at some point. But other than that, most of the changes are going on in the ecosystem around it.
That's incredible, because I think I've started several new projects since I first started using Redux, and I've mainly used it with React up until just recently. I'm using it. I'm starting a project and I chose to use Polymer, and I'm now using it with Polymer. So it's kind of my old faithful, So this is my first time using Polymer in a production environment. So I'm really excited about that. But so while I'm learning the tips and tricks about optimizing Polymer, I kind of don't have to learn Redux, right? And so it's really nice to be able to potentially start a new project with a new Vue library, where you're not learning everything. So I'm glad to hear that. So thank you. Don't change anything. Just freeze Redux. Like, put a sign on the GitHub page saying "frozen forever in time." Like,
I will say that your comment right there does bring up an interesting related point. So I think especially in the React community, there's kind of two different mindsets for how we architect and build applications. The first is very component centric. React is the way to do things, and anything that we could possibly build as a React component, we should. And okay, maybe we can reuse Redux to store some of the data, but it's a component-centric view of the world. And the second view I would classify as more application-centric. So that's not to say that React would just be like a dumb templating language in that respect, but that more of the logic and the data and the behavior is moved outside of React components into something separate like Redux. And so I think these are two different mindsets, and there are benefits to both sides. I was talking to Ryan Florence recently, and he was pointing out that if you implement some Ajax fetching behavior as a React component, then you don't have to worry about when you need to start and stop fetching or something. You just throw another fetch component into your render tree, and it happens when you need it to, instead of having to maybe like hook up some start and stop listeners and other things to trigger the behavior. On the other hand, if you do move more of your logic out into Redux or something like it, then maybe it is more separately reusable across multiple platforms or something like that. So there, like anything, there's pros and cons and trade-offs to both approaches. It's just kind of been interesting for me to kind of see people gravitating towards one or the other.
Yeah, I was hoping Justin would chime in with like, yeah, maybe people should just use web components. Like, but I'll chime in.
I could. You want to have that conversation today? Because we would have that conversation today. Like,
I just was like, I was gonna just say, it's like, wait, there is a way to do that, already. But yeah.
Yeah. Hashtag use the platform.
Oh my God. I am hashtag everybody is amazing and smart and can use whatever they want to use. But
I agree with that statement.
Yeah,
I think you should use what you want.
Yeah, totally. But we're not going to start that debate here. But I have to say,
no, Danny's not here.
Oh,
we
yeah.
only debate this with Danny. Where's Danny?
He's in sprint planning. Anyways, but Mark, I'm totally with you. And actually, whenever I give talks and talk to other engineers, I actually always say, hey, like keep your as much of your client side application logic in vanilla JavaScript as much as you can, because it just gives you a lot more extensibility and flexibility, but putting all of your logic in like some Ember component that's like super opinionated, it just kind of it doesn't like give you as much flexibility with what you might want to do in a year or two, when the next new shiny thing comes along, and so I'm really glad you highlighted that point. So we're almost out of time here, and I think we have time for one actual last question. So I think you can pick between talking about Redux and RX, then the story there with, and maybe highlighting MobX, or you can talk about how awesome the docs are. So I'll let you pick and choose. What do you want to talk about?
I'll answer the first really fast, and then move on to the docs.
Okay.
So
cool.
I see a lot of people asking, Redux versus MobX, which one should I use? And the answer is, it's really a question of what your preferences are and what style of programming you prefer. MobX is, if you write code with MobX, it's almost definitely going to be shorter. There's less indirection. There's less boilerplate, and there's a lot more, quote, magic happening under the hood. And it's also much more of an object-oriented approach to writing the code. And so if you come from a background where you're much more comfortable writing code that looks like direct mutation and object-oriented, then maybe MobX is a better choice for you. If you're from more of a functional programming background, or you want to lean that way, and you want to have everything be explicit and traceable, and maybe be able to do centralized behavior like logging out actions or using the dev tools and things like that, then maybe Redux is a better choice for that situation. They solve the same basic kinds of problems, but they do so in different ways. Now, I'm obviously very heavily biased towards Redux, but I can understand why people would want to use MobX, and it's not a bad choice at all. There's some excellent comparisons out there. If you look under the MobX tutorials section of my articles links list, I have a subsection that points to several different comparisons that go into a lot more detail about how the two are different. So for the docs, I am sort of the unofficial keeper of the Redux docs at this point, which kind of consists of a couple things. I wrote the FAQ, I wrote the structuring reducers section, and when people do submit pull requests that modify the docs, I'm usually the one that looks at them and also begs on Twitter for people to help contribute to the docs. And by the way, people listening to this, please help contribute to the Redux docs because they're never done. I can
add emojis if you want. I can add emojis to the docs.
Please do. But documentation is such a key thing for any library, but especially the more broadly used ones, because it tells you the concepts of a tool, how to learn the tool, what are the approved or intended uses of the tool, how to solve problems with the tool. And so good documentation is just such a key thing. And I see so many libraries out there that have just a tiny little README on the front of the GitHub repo with like a couple paragraphs and a 5-line code snippet, and that's it. And it's like, okay, well, maybe some libs, that's all they need. But good documentation is such a key thing. And we as maintainers only have so much time to actually work on different things. And maybe somebody out there is using things in a different way, or they have a question that the docs don't answer right now. And so getting all these different perspectives from other people and having them contribute to the docs makes it better for everybody, because you're getting the different perspectives, you're filling in gaps in what the docs actually cover. Maybe something gets described in a different way that would help someone with a different learning style. So I'm not sure I necessarily have tips for how to make the docs better or how to get people to work on the docs, other than first accumulate a Twitter following and then beg publicly, repeatedly. But yes, getting community involvement in making the docs better is a very important thing. And I think it's also a good way for people to first contribute, because maybe there aren't really any good issues that you can jump in on, or maybe you're intimidated by the process of building a tool or learning the code base. But even something as simple as, oh, hey, there's a grammar error or a problem with a code snippet in the docs, I can submit a PR and just make that little fix right there. That's a great way to get started in contributing to open source. So I'll put in a side pitch, not even for Redux, but for React. The React team recently rebuilt their entire documentation site and put it under a new URL, and they're using some new tools to build the content. And they want people to get from the community to get more involved and almost like take ownership of the React documentation. And so, certainly please feel free to contribute to the Redux docs, but the React docs are looking for people to help make them better right now. And there's multiple open issues with documentation tags waiting for people to jump in and say, yes, I would like to work on that. And we've got a few of those, those tagged issues on the Redux side as well. But if anyone out there isn't sure where to get started contributing to open source or helping out with a library, documentation PRs are a great way to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, the best docs are usually the ones that are written by the people that didn't implement the code, right? And I think the Google community is really famous for that. And I'm really happy to hear that the React team is adopting that as well. I think it's going to produce some stellar documentation. So that's wonderful. And so this brings us to our last question, Mark. This has been so much fun. But this is a question/personal plug from a conversation we had earlier. But I'm convinced that you should write a wonderful book from the wonderful publishers. Maybe O'Reilly, yes, O'Reilly, or you should write an O'Reilly book. Basically, is what I'm saying. And have you thought about
you just want the referral check, don't you?
Don't worry about the referral check. I connect. We had that moment on Twitter. I tagged them. So I tweeted this out and I tagged them. I was like, O'Reilly, he should write a book. And then they responded and saying, we're listening. So I'm hoping that there was a big follow-up conversation. I'm hoping you were at their headquarters for 2 weeks, negotiating your check and everything. So what happened? Are you thinking about this? If you're not, what can I do to make you think about it? Because you're a wonderful teacher and you should write,
Clone me and or find other ways to improve my productivity about 50x. I honestly, writing a book is not something I'm directly interested in. And honestly, definitely not for an actual publisher. I would rather write what I want to write on my own time without that sense of a deadline hanging over me. As it is, I actually have a gist with a list of all the other blog posts I want to write. There's already like 20 items in there that I don't even have time to get to. Preparing that React Boston talk actually sucked up like an entire month where I didn't work on anything else. But I do have a whole bunch more blog posts I want to write, tutorials and some other articles that I want to cover. Maybe even a super secret side project that's not actually a book, but if I can manage to find time to keep working on it, I might actually get that done and announced at some point. Please keep your eye on the blog and the Twitter for further notices. But no, writing a book is not something I actually really want to do. Even though there have been several people who suggested that, yourself included.
Oh, well, so there goes my referral check, so I'm sad.
Sorry.
but that's fine. As long as you're writing and you already are, that's great. I just kind of was hoping we could immortalize your learnings, in the book format while that's still a thing. So, but I'm glad to hear that you're working on lots of other fun projects, and we'll link to all of those in the show notes. So any last words of wisdom that we missed before we wrap up?
Probably, but I can't think of them right now.
Okay, cool. And so where can people find you online? And do you have any upcoming talks or courses or publications that you want to share?
So I'm at AceMarkE in most places, Twitter, Reactiflux, HN, and Reddit. And I'm at Mark Erikson on GitHub and Stack Overflow. I tweet fairly often, a little irregularly, but fairly often. And I usually hang out in the Reactiflux chat channels most evenings, US time. You can definitely find me there very, very frequently. In fact, there's usually a flood of answers from me most evenings as I get home and scroll through the day's messages. And then, of course, my two links lists for React and Redux articles and Redux add-ons are both under my GitHub. I'm sorry, what was the other half of that question?
Oh, any talks upcoming or courses, publications, anything coming, that you want to share? Feel free to plug that. But right. I know you have a secret project that you can't plug yet. But
yeah, nothing specifically planned. The React Boston was my first ever public conference talk. I do have one other talk idea that I'd submitted to a couple places and did not get accepted, and I haven't tried resubmitting it anywhere else. There may be one other thing happening sometime next spring that's also in the works, but I don't have a lot of details on that. I realize that's incredibly vague and useless.
Oh, no, totally not. So for people wondering, this Reactive Flux, what is this? It's
Sure.
Reactive Flux is a channel on Discourse, and you can find a link to it on
Discord.
Discord. Sorry.
Yeah. Discord and Discourse are totally separate things.
They are. I realized that when I said that. Discord. So Discord is it's like Slack for gamers.
Discord is like Slack. It was originally more oriented for gaming groups, but it turns out to also have all the features needed to hang out and answer and discuss programming topics. And so Reactive Flux is a specific Discord server setup. We generally discuss anything related to React and a lot of JavaScript stuff. So there's a general channel, a need help channel, channels for Redux, React Router, Gatsby, Flow, Immutable JS, things like that. So if people have questions, or they want to talk about anything React related, I highly encourage you to come by Reactive Flux and drop in and talk. There's always people hanging out, happy to answer questions.
Yeah. And on that note, we want to say thank you so much. Thank you for what you do for the community. Thank you for coming on our show. Thank you for being who you are.
Well, thank you very much for having me. This is also the first podcast I've ever been on, and I had fun.
That's so exciting. Thank you so much. So Justin, do you want to close this out?
Sure thing. This has been episode number 142 of the Web Platform Podcast. We talked about Redux with Mark Erikson. We hope you enjoyed it. Tune in next week when we talk about more things web. And we hope you have a great rest of your week.